joining us this morning.
Morning, Katlego, and good morning to your viewers.
A very grim story about sex trafficking and just opening our eyes to what's continuously happening in the world, even though we are not aware. Let's just localize it a bit. How rife is sex trafficking in South Africa?
Well, I would think that you would find that sex trafficking is rife across the world.
Right.
The question is, how high profile is it? And we know we've got problems with foreign nationals being trafficked into South Africa, both for sex and also for labor. And also we know that we have had sex rings that have been uncovered in South Africa. And that's not just involving female victims, also male victims. So for example, a few years back, there was speculation around some of the former apartheid ministers. And a book that was published around the Lost Boys of Bird Island. There's even speculation around some of the sporting codes where there might be trafficking through that. But unfortunately, sex trafficking is much more prominent and much more common than we would know.
So just talk to us maybe about the economic disparities that often contribute or could contribute towards this. You speak about foreign nationals that could be brought into the country, just some of the systematic issues that we have that could open loopholes into sex trafficking.
So the two big things that you see in sex trafficking rings are currency and control. So when you start with currency, what you're looking at is why would somebody be lured into that ring? And that might be anything from a financial currency to get fame, to be more high profile, to be close to, particularly in those very prominent scandals overseas, to be close to somebody who's very famous. It might be something like that. They might be lured in through a modeling contract or false promise of work. And then what happens is once they're lured in, what the traffickers do is they exercise control over them. And that could be anything from removing their passports to some of these crimes take place in remote islands where they're often children, but the victims can't escape. They might get them addicted to drugs. And often what happens as well is that they make them complicit in crimes. So the Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell cases, which were very prominent in the US a while back, what they did was they got the girls to recruit other girls. And so they realized that if they were to talk out and to get their perpetrators arrested, that they potentially would face criminal charges as well.
Sure. That's very sad. So just speaking about the characteristics of those that run these rings, I mean, we saw now with the Sean Puffy Combs, in terms of his case, it sort of gave us an eye into the world of hip-hop and what could possibly be happening in that sense. You mentioned that in South Africa, the former apartheid ministers were allegedly also involved in something like this. Who would we see as the mastermind in South Africa in democracy 30 years after apartheid to be running such rings?
So often rich and powerful and influential, and sometimes potentially the way that they become rich and powerful and influential is through the sex trafficking rings. Because what we need to understand is that there's a sexual element to it, but there's also an extortion element to it. So again, going back to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, what they did was they found very high profile people, included them in their sex trafficking rings, and then blackmailed them into favors, money, freedom from prosecution. So I think you can see that that would be common throughout. And also because, I mean, sometimes there's violence involved in kidnapping victims, and these are not always things that are as high profile, but they do often involve very influential people.
I mean, you're speaking of people possibly being kidnapped, but earlier on you spoke about how people would be lured into this. The digital age and the advancements of technology, how much has that played a role in what we are seeing now in this growing trend?
Enormous. We're seeing enormous increases in online grooming, and the process of grooming is far shortened when it's online, because you don't have to go through the process of grooming other people. You're just generally grooming a victim. In addition, I mean, you look at South Africa, our economic circumstances are so dire that when somebody might be offered a job online, they don't necessarily have the right resources to be able to check out if it's real or not. And, you know, we counsel people that if it's too good to be true, it probably is. But more than that, you need to be very careful about responding to mass calls online, or the person who meets you in the park and says, you're very beautiful, wouldn't you like a modeling contract? Or, you know, it's often through things like that that we see, especially girls, but often boys as well, lured in to these rings.
You keep mentioning the possibility of boys being lured in, and we don't think of it as a norm.
No.
How rife is it? How more of our young boys are being brought into such situations without them even being aware?
So huge. I mean, sexual crimes against boys and girls are equal in number. And although you know, when we look at these high-profile cases, you know, often the face of the victim is a female face. Right. The fact is, I mean, the South African cases actually almost exclusively involved men and young boys. But actually, it could equally be men and women. And in fact, from an extortion point of view, sometimes if the victims are boys, especially with the former apartheid ministers, you can imagine how much leverage they had if the victims were boys,
of course, over
the people who were involved in those rings.
How important is the voice of civil society in situations like this? I mean, an organization such as yourselves, how much of an influence do you make in policy reform, in ensuring that perpetrators are brought to book, and most importantly, the rehabilitation of these victims?
So we have fantastic legislation in South Africa. Unfortunately, the application of it is not always that good. And a lot of the lobbying is around the application of it. And even just finding out details like statistics. I think we're in huge amounts of denial as to how much trafficking is a phenomenon in South Africa. And so externalizing that and showing, again, as I mentioned, this is not just around sex. A lot of it is around labor. And the poorer the country, the more you get trafficking for labor. But South Africa, we've seen huge numbers of children and adults trafficked for sex crimes. And it's meant that from an international perspective, we keep on getting downgraded from the US because we're actually not taking this seriously enough. So just telling stories of victims becomes incredibly important, because once you actually hear somebody's story, it's very hard to look away and to pretend that this isn't real and it isn't affecting real people that might be real people that we actually know even.
And which countries do we see as a common denominator in terms of where they're being trafficked to?
So like I say, a lot of people are actually trafficked into South Africa, but we would also be an exit point as well. And, you know, this is, I mean, it would depend on the individual syndicate as to where they are trafficking to. But the thing particularly about trafficking of children is that the movement component is not as important. It's the rest of the component that is important. So they don't necessarily even need to go across national boundaries to be trafficked. It's about the rest of the phenomenon of being deprived of their rights, of being sexually violated, of being controlled. All of those things are important in terms of the definition of trafficking. But it is literally going on underneath our noses.
Sure. You mentioned how powerful the circles of trafficking are, and I can imagine that it must be difficult for police to be able to crack down on these very powerful individuals. Do we find that the policing services are at times complacent? Maybe they could get paid off, or they're simply told by those in power to lay off?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of those. And I mean, in fact, our former Minister of Police very, troublingly mentioned a while back that we didn't have the financial resources to be able to police online crimes. Which is deeply shocking. But what you need is intellectual collaboration. And in fact, often our crimes that we are made aware of are coming from overseas. So we're being told by Interpol or by police services in the US or the UK that there are trafficking rings. And then there's international cooperation. But because they do cross geographic boundaries, it becomes far more difficult to police. And you know, we're just struggling with crime that's in front of us, let alone crime that's hidden and online.
What would you say just some of the myths and misconception about sex trafficking? We mentioned the involvement of young boys, but just how these myths and misconceptions contribute in awareness and not necessarily being aware of what's happening around you in your circumstances.
So one of the biggest problems is that we tell our children about stranger danger, but we don't tell them about the danger from the people that are closest to them. And you know, I think the most common myth is the child being abducted off the street. You know, it's very high profile. It's the kind of thing that everybody's looking for that child, and then that child is moved 60 times before they get to the point where they end up in their in the place where they're being trafficked. But actually that doesn't happen a lot of the time. Often it's a friend who says, don't you want to come to this party? And then the person is drugged, and then, or alternatively, it's somebody who says, come, we're going to go for this job interview together. You know, it could even be, sometimes it's partners, sometimes it's even family members. We have family members selling their children into sex trafficking. So I think this idea that it's out there and that it's not close to home is very problematic. And the idea that actually, you know, it's going to be something which everybody's going to know when somebody gets trafficked. Often, especially children who are coming from child and youth care centres, who are not necessarily as well looked after by individual family members, or they don't have a parent at home who's very concerned about them, they can be gone for years before anybody actually starts looking for them.
Sure, Robin, this is very frightening, but of course, we certainly do hope that such awareness gets around to not just children, but parents and community members as a whole, so that we can avert any incidences of sex trafficking. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing these insights with us. That is for the Voiceless founder, Robin Wolfson Voster, speaking to us there about the increase in sex trafficking in South Africa and globally.